all the brave men and women like him who give their last breath in defense of our country. We honor their memory and their sacrifice, and we also hope to honor them with our deeds to prove worthy of their sacrifice. Because there is no peace without those willing to bear the scars and wounds of war. There is no strength without those brave enough to protect the weak and the people that need protection. And there is no prosperity at home without those willing to shoulder our burdens overseas. That glorious American flag represents the blood of patriots spilled in defense of freedom. It represents the courage that burns in American hearts. It represents the unity that binds us all together as one. And it represents the freedoms bestowed on us by Almighty God. You are the warriors of freedom. You are the protectors of that great American flag. You are the patriots who keep the fires of liberty burning. And you are the ones who protect the God-given freedoms that are the birthright of every single American child. I am proud to be with you today as your Commander-in-Chief. I am honored to have had this time to spend with you. I am excited for the great adventures and achievements that all of us will accomplish together. May God bless you. May God bless our service members. May God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
On this Memorial Day weekend, President Donald Trump in Sicily, Italy, focusing on the sacrifices made by all the troops all over the world, visiting here at the Naval Air Station in Sigonella, Italy, focusing on those sacrifices that have been made, particularly the ultimate sacrifice, which is that which we are honoring in this Memorial Day weekend. We still have with us General Jack Keane and former CIA Director Jim Woolsey. General Keane, you know, it is extraordinary that we seem to have one administration that focuses on peace through strength. Another administration comes along, kind of lowers the guard a little. Then another one has to come back. That's what happened. We had Carter, who didn't perhaps spend as much as he should. We had Ronald Reagan spending a lot more than many people said he should have spent. Then we had Bill Clinton enjoying the peace dividend after the Reagan and Bush years. Then we had President Obama letting down a little bit after George Bush built up. So now we have the buildup again, no?
Yes, but we've never had a president that I'm aware of since World War II who saw the world so differently. Most of our presidents, Democrat and Republicans, have always seen America on the world stage promoting global security and stability, and the byproduct of that is economic prosperity. President Obama didn't see it that way. He pulled America back from its global leadership role. And matter of fact, he accommodated our adversaries. And as a result of it, our adversaries were emboldened, our allies and our friends, they began to not trust us. They didn't think we were reliable. And the world actually got worse. The world got more dangerous. And I've never seen anything like it. And yes, this president has come along. I think he largely won an election partly because he wanted to return America to its traditional leadership role and promote stability and security. That's what this visit is really all about.
Well, Jim Woolsey,
he's given everybody notice that America is back on the world stage.
Who would have guessed, Jim Woolsey, that a president who was kind of chided for not having the foreign policy experience, maybe as a businessman, but not as a politician or a diplomat, people said, well, he may have some successes on the home front, but abroad, it's not likely to be successful. He's had more successes in turning things around, the way General Keane just suggested, than he has arguably on the domestic front, certainly in the legislative arena. Go ahead, Jim.
That's right. I think that he, on the domestic side of things, he's got a big step in trying to get the health care done right, because that probably has to happen before he can move into doing the tax revisions and tax cuts, and the prosperity in a way depends on that.
But again, what he outlined just briefly for us in Italy, the extraordinary visit first with the Arab nations, then meeting with the head of the religious leader of Roman Catholics in the form of the Pope, and finally with the European leaders. I mean, this was a kind of a diplomatic tour de force, a hat trick, if you will, that a lot of people said he couldn't pull off.
This was big. He shifted the political ground in Europe, and I think with Russia, I hope very much with Iran. Because that's where I think, other than with North Korea, I think that's where the first real contest is going to come between Iran and its various poodles, such as Hezbollah and Hamas and so forth, on the one hand, versus him and Israel and the Sunni, largely, on the other. And that's going to come to a head.
Where, Jim, do you think that his critics, what was their blind spot in not recognizing that this was a man who could go over and so profoundly change the image of the United States abroad?
I think a number of people got sort of locked into the Obama worldview that Jack Keane stated very well, which was, hey, it's not our responsibility, party time. And certainly that whole attitude, which basically gave up on America's role of world leadership, was not only abandoned but mocked. And I think he had the backbone to make a major start in turning that around.
General Keane, I don't think it's only his detractors and perhaps his enemies who poo-pooed this trip and said he wasn't going to accomplish anything, but a lot of supporters didn't have necessarily the confidence in his ability to perform overseas as well as he did. I think that this trip really changed that, don't you?
Oh, yes, there's no doubt about it. I mean, the problems of the world, I had the opportunity to talk to him myself about this because, you know, like most presidents, he does not have much foreign policy or national security background. And most presidents are pretty quick studies when it comes to the world. But the problems of the world come to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. You're not able to control that. And that started almost immediately with North Korea, with Iran. He has sanctioned both of them. And now he's uniting the Arab Muslim world to stand up against the Iranians and radical Islam. That's leadership. And I'm delighted to see him do it. He is stepping up. And he's exercising that leadership role once again. And I know, because I've been in contact with our allies in the Middle East, they are absolutely overwhelmed with enthusiasm about what just took place. So, yes, he's performed exceptionally well in terms of foreign policy and national security.
Well, Jim Woolsey, one of the ways in which perhaps he hasn't performed as well is his underestimation for the animosity inside the Beltway, and the fact that in fact, these leaks just keep coming out over and over, clearly by some people who want to undermine the work that he's been doing. Whoever they are, we're not sure. We may never find out. Hopefully we will, and hopefully they'll be prosecuted to the extent that they broke the law. But he did seem to underestimate, whether it's, you know, a dark state, if you will, as some people have suggested, within the intel community or not, is beside the point. The president really doesn't seem to have been able to control it. Do you think he will?
I could be biased by my couple years of service out there and the high regard I have for the folks who work at the CIA, but there are other possibilities for the leaks. For example, holdover appointees from the previous administration, because there are a lot of those folks still in the jobs that they were in, because this administration has not been able to get its act together quickly enough in order to get a number of those slots filled.
Is that the responsibility of this administration, or is it because the Democrats have blocked any kind of appointments that would help them clear the decks to the people who might be the leakers?
I think this administration could have gotten started a good deal faster than it did. but it's beginning to move now, and that's good. I do think that the leaks are terrible. That's more of a cascade than I've seen in 40 plus years in Washington. Many of them working on these issues, and I just can't come to terms with what people think they are accomplishing by turning loose information about the way we collect intelligence. I was in a debate with one of them a few months back, and I asked him, I said, you've just disclosed the way the CIA works with the Mexican intelligence in trying to prevent trafficking in women and children. What are you trying to do? You're trying to be a pimp, help the pimps, what? And that, he didn't really have an answer.
General Keane, how do we track down these leakers and how do we get rid of them?
Well, my advice to the administration would be put your head down and do the work of the people. And don't get paranoid about this thing. This is an area where you really can't control it. And yes, I agree with Jim. It's the worst I've ever seen, to be sure. Turn it over to the Justice Department, which he's done, and get about the nation's business and stop worrying and wringing your hands over it. Just get on with doing what's right for the country.
Good advice.
Our own John Roberts, of course, has been following the president throughout this trip. And John, I'm just wondering exactly how much of a weight this new leak that came out, and I don't think it was any coincidence that it was issued on a Friday of a long holiday weekend right before the president was to come back. If anybody had any doubts about the political timing of these leaks, I think those doubts have been answered, no? If John Roberts can
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, David. Somebody was in my ear as you were leading into me. It used to be that if you wanted to bury something, that you released it at 5 o'clock on a Friday night. But now with social media the way it is and the internet taking over the news cycle, you put something out at 5 o'clock on a Friday night, and people get the entire weekend to chew it over, and it kind of just revolves around in the laundry drum of the internet. And it looks like that's probably what this was designed to do. We don't even know for sure if this was actually said or whether or not this was disinformation from Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador to the United States, just wanted to kind of throw a little, smoke in the air or mud in the water, however you want to put it, in terms of what was discussed during that meeting between Jared Kushner and Michael Flynn and Sergei Kislyak back at the beginning of December at Trump Tower. We were originally told when we first learned about that meeting back in March that it was kind of a get-to-know-you type of thing. But I'm also told by sources close to Jared Kushner that if indeed they did talk about this idea of establishing some sort of secure line of communications between the transition and Russia, it likely would have been to allow Michael Flynn, who was going to be the national security advisor, a secure line of communication with generals in Moscow who would only talk over a secure line so that they could sort of get a basis of understanding going between them on Syria and some other thorny issues before President Trump took over as president on Inauguration Day. So it's being portrayed as this was a prudent action to take. Of course, it's being seen in other circles as being something less than that.
Yeah, I also want to ask, though, the president sort of summarized in between his salute to the troops, which was very moving, but he summarized what this trip meant, what he accomplished, what he meant to do, and what he did do. Now, of course, it's from his perspective, but I think even a lot of his detractors have to agree that what he did particularly in Saudi Arabia was extraordinary, just speaking truth to that power there to drive out the terrorists within their midst. He did get to turn NATO into more focusing directly on the terror threat, rather than its historic focus on the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist anymore. So it was a tremendous resetting of our security desires as a nation. No.
I think when you look at the trip as a whole, even somebody who wasn't necessarily a fan of the president would have to say that on the overall, it was a very fruitful trip for the president. I mean, let's take a look at what has
sort of been laid out there in terms of things that the president did wrong. But people are complaining he didn't mention America's commitment to Article 5 at NATO. But the ceremony itself was all about Article 5, and he invoked Article 5, and the nations of NATO all came together after 9/11. Then there was the fact that he seemed to push aside the Prime Minister of Montenegro. Well, the Prime Minister of Montenegro, if you know his history, is very capable of taking care of himself. And then there was this idea that the president called out 23 of 28 nations in NATO to say that they haven't been paying their fair share, which Jens Stoltenberg, who is the Secretary General of NATO, thinks is a good thing, because embarrassing these nations into living up to their 2% commitment to NATO is something that's going to bring more money into the treaty alliance and will help benefit NATO. And when you take a look at how America is bearing the lion's share of the burden when it comes to NATO, you have a lot of countries who are paying their 2% of GDP, but you have other countries, including the one that I am in now, is not even living up to 1% of its GDP, and America is paying 3.61% of its GDP. It does look like there is an unfair sharing of the burden here. So right. I think even Stoltenberg is up for this idea, David, of better sharing the burden among the 28 NATO members, soon to be 29 NATO members.
And, I have to say, we focused a segment on the snickering of some of the leaders, the European leaders, as the president was trying to get them to put up more money for their military spending. And we just got word that French President Macron has, if he was among the snickers, he's changed his tune dramatically, John. He now praises Donald Trump's, quote, capacity to listen. He said, I found someone who is open and willing to deal well with us. So on his departure, at least, they are praising him very highly.
And one of the things I think that the European leaders really appreciate is the fact that President Trump has been willing to listen to their concerns about the Paris Climate Accord. This is going to be a very thorny issue next week when the president comes back to Washington, because initially it looked like he was just going to pull out of the Paris Accord. He's got the EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt. He's got his Chief Strategist Steve Bannon all saying it's better for America if we get out. But then on the other side, he's got Jared Kushner, he's got Gary Cohn saying not so fast. It would be very complicated and would complicate things if the United States were to get out. And the president listened to the European leaders. We heard Gary Cohn say that a short time ago in this press conference. And and he also said yesterday that the president's thinking about Paris was, quote, evolving. So, I mean, we may find that when the president gets back to Washington, he still pulls the United States out of the Paris Agreement, but he just might surprise people and not do it.
Well, John Roberts, we miss you. We want you to come home. It's been 9 days. I'm sure your family misses you. We certainly do. And as we can see here, the president's plane, Air Force One, has begun to taxi to the runway on its way back to the United States. And we wish him well. Safe travels to our president and the First Lady and all those who accompanied him on this trip. Well, as we just heard, President Trump pulling no punches, telling it like it is during his first foreign trip, something NATO leaders heard a couple of days ago. Take a listen.
I have been very, very direct with Secretary Stoltenberg and members of the alliance in saying that NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations.
Now, some saying that's a lot like President Reagan sounded during one of his trips to Europe. Take a listen to that.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The man who actually wrote those lines joins us now, former Ronald Reagan speechwriter Peter Robinson, joining us from Stanford, California. Peter, let's just get out of the way. First of all, Trump is no Reagan. We understand that. We get that. But Trump has done, particularly on this trip, and not only what he said in Europe, but what he said to the Arab leaders, drive them out, these terrorists in your midst, drive them out, these purveyors of death. We had this assumption that this is just something we have to live with, that terrorism will be with us forever. This president is saying, not so. We can end the terrorist threat, the terrorist crisis that we've been in. Very much like Ronald Reagan said, we don't have to live with the Cold War. We can win it. To which you say?
To which I say that's exactly, the parallel is precisely correct, David. There's a marvelous moment, 1977, I believe it was, when the president was going over foreign policy matters. He was between serving as governor and had not yet been elected president. but he was talking over foreign policy matters with Dick Allen, a friend of yours and mine, who served in the Reagan administration. And Dick told me the story years later that the president said, by the way, Dick, would you like to hear my theory of the Cold War? Dick Allen said, of course, Mr. President. And Ronald Reagan said, well, my theory of the Cold War is we win and they lose. And it was just as tight and blunt as that. And now we have in Donald Trump, he's not as polished a speaker. As you said, he's not Ronald Reagan, but that central insistence, it's a kind of moral imagination. He's willing to invite people to see a world in which we don't have to put up with this anymore.
Right.
We can win and they can lose.
And we were literally told by the Obama administration that this is just something we have to live with. This president says, no, it's not. We can fight it and we can win against it.
That's exactly right. And again, there's the parallel, again, is very striking. Jimmy Carter gave a speech at Notre Dame years ago in which he warned Americans against the inordinate fear of communism, the notion that we would have to learn to live with them, that they'd be around for a long time, we'd be around for a long time. And Ronald Reagan came in and simply changed the way people thought about the matter. Likewise, once again, Barack Obama, at your conversation with Jim Woolsey and Jack Keane, as so often happens on Fox News, the essential point got made. Barack Obama engaged in a long retreat from the rest of the world, and the rest of the world got more dangerous. Along comes Donald Trump, and say what you want about his speaking style, about this or that, the leaks. All that is secondary. He is reasserting the American place in the world.
Right, right. And some people already belittle the drive them out speech in Saudi Arabia, which meant so much in changing the direction of the U.S. in relation to our Arab allies. He didn't write it, obviously, his speech, but Ronald Reagan didn't write tear down that wall. You did. You wrote those lines. But the president chooses what to say. And I know that there were people that were opposed to him saying, Ronald Reagan saying what you wrote, correct?
Pretty nearly the entire foreign policy apparatus of the United States government, David, opposed that speech. The State Department, the National Security Council, the ranking diplomat on the ground in Berlin, all opposed that speech. Colin Powell and I went nose to nose. Colin Powell was then number 2 in the National Security Council staff at that time. And it was Ronald Reagan. I wouldn't have written that speech for anyone other than Ronald Reagan. We speechwriters were always trying to give Ronald Reagan back to himself, so to speak. We knew his mind, what he would respond to. And so I wouldn't have written that for anybody else, and nobody else would have overruled the foreign policy apparatus to insist on delivering that speech. Likewise, the Trump administration. I don't know the speechwriters there well, but I have had a couple of conversations with Stephen Miller, and it is very clear that they're not trying to invent Donald Trump. They're trying to take the policies they understand, the principles that he believes in, the speaking style that he has so well, that was well formed. Donald Trump isn't trying, they're not trying to invent a voice. They're not trying to invent policies. They're writing material that comports with Donald Trump himself.
Peter, stay with us. We have another gentleman who is quite familiar with the way White Houses operate, the way speeches are written and delivered and chosen by the president. Mr. Pat Buchanan now joining us on the phone. Pat, I'm sure you saw the drive them out speech by President Trump when he was in Saudi Arabia. I'm just wondering, do you think he did have pushback from some people at State Department or the CIA saying, Mr. President, that's a little too strong for our Arab allies?
Well, my understanding of President Trump is that he would ignore pushback and might even push back against that. So I do think, David, I saw him on this speech just now at the Sigonella. It was really exuberant. It was patriotic. It was really America first. America is back. The marked contrast in demeanor with President Obama is really astonishing. And I think the president, of course, he's directed us toward a new course, both in the Middle East and in Saudi Arabia and in Europe, and we're going to see how it works out. But I will say, what he did in Europe was basically read them the riot act and say, in effect, I'm not fooling around. You folks are going to have to pay more and pony up for your share of the defense of the West. And the United States has carried the undue load too long. And I think that's exactly what they needed to hear. It's going to jolt a lot of people in Washington as well as it did in Europe. But I think he did a great job. And at the close, I was pretty touched because my uncle went ashore in in Sicily with that same fellow that he talked about. It was very, very moving.
Extraordinary. The man who would have been 97 had he not been killed on the shores of Italy. Peter, I just want to talk about the after effect of what happened when Ronald Reagan so dramatically changed the direction of the United States vis-a-vis the Cold War. It didn't really, the wall didn't really come down under Reagan's watch. It came down in 1989, December, under the watch of George Bush, the first George Bush.
Yes.
Do you think it will take that long before the power and the truth of the words that we heard spoken in Saudi Arabia will really have an effect here?
Well, let's hope it happens that quickly. The wall came down 18 months after Reagan delivered that speech, sooner than any of us. I think even Pat himself would agree with that. Happened much faster than any of us expected. But here was the sequence. Ronald Reagan delivered the speech. The Soviets changed their behavior. Mikhail Gorbachev, we now know, told the East Germans, if you have trouble, we're keeping the Red Army in the barracks. You're on your own. And then the German people themselves took care of the problem and tore down the wall. So what we hope here is that President Trump delivered this very powerful speech. Again, I think you're right that May 21st speech in Saudi Arabia, by the way, there's one line that's been overlooked, but I think it's a very powerful line. Terrorists do not worship God. They worship death.
Absolutely.
That is as memorable and compelling a line as any president has delivered.
Yeah.
So, but you hope that the Arabs who were listening to that speech, including, let's say, the Saudis themselves, who for many years now have funded Wahhabism, an extreme form of Islam, that they change their behavior, and then in the final act of this sequence, that Muslim people themselves throughout the Middle East decide they've had enough of this terrorism.
Well, Pat Buchanan, you know, another thing we've had enough of is not only the terrorists, but the folks who are opposed to changing the dynamic in the way that President Trump has suggested it be changed. That is, the status quo, or perhaps you could even use the word swamp as the president have, who are so accustomed to doing things the way they've been done for years that they oppose any kind of change.
Well, not only that, what's going on in D.C. is what's called the deep state of the permanent government, David, and it's not simply leaks out of the White House which are political or which are petty. You're getting national security leaks out of the FBI and the NSA and places like that, which are de facto crimes. And I think when the president comes home, he ought to set aside a division over at the FBI, headed by a special prosecutor, to run down the criminal leaks and prosecute and punish these people. You can't run a foreign policy when you've got antagonists and opponents in that foreign policy really damaging the national interest of the United States in order to damage the commander-in-chief.
But what about the pushback? They're not all leakers. Some of the people who are pushing back are established members of the political bureaucracy, if you will, that just oppose any kind of change. By the way, we are looking at Air Force One. Looks like the takeoff taxi on his way from Sigonella Air Base in Italy, in Sicily, back home after a 9-day trip. An extraordinary trip, which started out in Saudi Arabia. And we should mention, by the way, it was the first time Air Force One or any plane that we know of, any commercial plane or any diplomatic plane, traveled directly, nonstop, from Saudi Arabia to Israel. Pat Buchanan, that alone is worth mentioning.
It was dramatic indeed, and there's a tremendous amount of hope in the Middle East. The president's a new man, that Barack Obama isn't there. But I will say this, David. Look, they're talking about putting 3,000 more American troops into Afghanistan, where we've been for 15 years. We saw even yesterday or the day before Coptic Christians massacred in Egypt. This is going to be a long, long war. There's no doubt about that. It's Peter Robinson did a great job with that speech, and the wall came down, and I didn't anticipate it. But that was a long war for those of us who were involved in the Cold War. And I don't think this one's going to end that dramatically. It's going to have to end gradually, and we're going to be at war with these people for a long, long time.
By the way, President Nixon, just as every president in the past 40, 50, 60 years since the creation of Israel has tried to broker peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, to greater or lesser things seem to come together. We had that dramatic meeting of Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin back in the 70s. They shook hands. Everybody was crying when that happened. And of course, a couple of years later, Sadat had been assassinated. Then we had another one where an Israeli prime minister was assassinated. So they always seem to fall apart. Do you think the same will happen with this effort to bring peace in the Middle East or not?
I'm afraid I do agree that it's not going to, peace is not going to come to the Middle East, I don't think, in this term. And I don't know where it will then, because earlier you had General Keane on. There are irreconcilable positions between the Palestinians and the Israeli governments, which are increasingly to the right. And I don't think that Netanyahu is going to make the kinds of concessions that would be needed. And I think that the Palestinians are going to make demands that the Israelis can't meet. Palestinians want their capital in Jerusalem, and they're not going to get it. They're going to want settlers off the West Bank, and they're not going to get it. Bibi Netanyahu opposed the removal of 8,000 from Gaza. Is he going to execute the removal of hundreds of thousands from the West Bank? I think the president has got a good idea going after things, sending people over there, but I would not be terribly optimistic.
But on the terror front and redirecting NATO and getting the Arab allies to fight this terror fight like they never have before, I think it's fair to say this has been an extraordinary, much more successful trip than anybody imagined.
And it's successful and it's dramatic, and I think there is a new man in town.
Yeah, indeed there is. Pat Buchanan, always a pleasure to hear from you. We thank General Jack Keane, Jim Woolsey, former CIA director, and, of course, Peter Robinson, who worked with Ronald Reagan. We want to turn a little bit to the economy now and how events overseas may be affecting events and your money right here. Kerry Sheffield joins us along with Gary B. Smith, Jonas Max Ferris, and Tracy Carrasco. Well, so far, Tracy, the market has done pretty well. It looked like it was kind of idling along, particularly as the president was here dealing with these constant problems at home. But as soon as he left and gave that speech last weekend in Saudi Arabia, the market responded positively and has been doing very well ever since.
You know, we really haven't seen too much reaction in terms of what happened after the incident in Manchester. We did see the Dow drop on May 17th, nearly 373 points. That was after the reports of the memo, from Comey and discussing Flynn. We did see that drop, but since then the market has come back. Yeah. The Trump rally seems to be getting back on track there. And
we're over a % growth just this week. It's partly because of that. And Kerry, the bottom line is nobody saw it coming. Everybody thought that, the president's problems would probably follow him overseas, that he might stumble here or there. It didn't happen, and the market has responded very positively.
Well, I think because people are realizing there's a focus on policy that you're seeing congressional Republicans, for example, they're moving forward the Choice Act, which would really dismantle a lot of the problems associated with Dodd-Frank, for example, progress on healthcare reform. It's advancing in the Senate. There are substantive economic reforms that I think that's part of what we're seeing in the market in terms of the rebound.
But Gary B., we talked about this, Steve Forbes. Then we have the drag on the part of the Republicans. John Boehner, the former Speaker of the House, saying that it's a pipe dream that the president's going to get tax cuts.
Yeah, exactly. I think Boehner's comments were interesting, by the way. I don't know if he's kind of talking his book, as they say, he's still a little bit bitter, or he was speaking the truth. But even apart from that, it seems like we're living from headline to headline, tweet to tweet. Maybe we go through that in every administration. Maybe my memory is just short. But now, boy, you cannot. The first thing when I wake up in the morning, I check is Twitter to see if anything happened, if Trump said something, if the Washington Post has come out with a headline. I like the market right now. I think we're in good shape. That down day rattled me, though. Rarely do you have a down day like we did, the 340-point down day, and then go straight back up. My fear right now is that we have some other headline, and then it's another 500-point down day. So I'm positive, but living in fear right now.
Yeah. But Jonas, again, it's
record levels back to 99 levels. You see it in millennial day trading with these new apps on margin, like late 90s. You see it in cryptocurrency gambling online. So there is whatever caused the initial rally, it is not solely driven by the likelihood of a high tax cut being a permanent tax cut at this point. It is more just investor
optimism. Let me just get Kerry in for a second here again, talking about this trip, because what we have seen with the economies of Europe is a reblossoming that a lot of people didn't see. We've seen some of the hard right candidates fail, but we've seen the far left candidates fail as well. And a lot of the people like Macron and others who've come in have been pretty pro-market, right?
Well, yeah, no, and I agree with Jonas that it's not just the Trump bump, from the inauguration. There are more sustainable things that are happening. You look what the Trump administration, fortunately, is dismantling a lot of the bureaucratic Obama regulations on the economy,
right.
on regulation.
And it's happening all over the world. That's the point.
Yes.
And I think what this trip did, forgive me for interrupting, but I think what it did was bring what's happening abroad to what's happening here and focusing on what needs to be done, particularly speaking truth to power in Saudi Arabia and Europe. Jonas, Max Ferris, Tracy Carrasco, Carrie Sheffield, Gary B. Smith, thank you all for coming in. Great to see you all. Much more to come right here on Fox News. We'll see you soon.